Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Ryder, and I am the National Director of Jews for a Secular Democracy. Welcome to Threats to Marriage Equality, a conversation with Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel. We are really thrilled that you were able to join us today. Before we move on, I do want to say Happy Veterans Day and a special shout out and appreciation to all of you who served our country. We really honor and respect your service. And now we are going to move forward, starting with a thank you, and you can see on the screen, to our many co-sponsors. We at JFSAD work very hard to partner with other nonprofits. We are a 501c3, and we really enjoy and push to work with other nonprofits. We think that it brings value to everything we do, and it certainly increases the impact for all of us. So thank you to everybody who co-sponsored this, and thank you to Attorney General Dana Nessel for being here. And I am going to introduce our amazing Michigan Director, Nomi Joy Rich, who is going to take over. Thank you very much.
Hi, and Dana, it is great to see you again. It's been a long time since I've seen you in person. I want to thank all of our co-sponsors again, and especially I want to thank you, AG Nessel. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today. Dana Nessel is a former criminal prosecutor and civil rights attorney. Before she is now serving her second term as Michigan's 54th Attorney General. Before taking office, she was the lead attorney for the plaintiffs in DeBoer versus Snyder. This was a precursor to the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell v. Hodges, which codified same-sex marriage rights nationwide. Throughout her time in office, AG Nessel has proven herself to be a staunch advocate for the safety and dignity of all Michigan residents, even and especially against trespasses by the federal government. Please join me in welcoming AG Nessel, Dana Nessel. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So you were lead counsel in DeBoer v. Snyder, the Michigan case that became part of the landmark Obergefell v. Hodges decisions. Can you explain the significance of that case and share what drew you to that case and what did that teach you about the fight for equality?
Well, firstly, let me say a few things that are just sort of fun facts about Obergefell v. Hodges, but really also about my case, DeBoer versus Snyder. Our case came first before all of the other cases in the Sixth Circuit. We were only the third case in American history where the issue of marriage equality was actually put to a trial in a federal district court before a judge. And as it moved up through the courts, the caption of this was actually DeBoer v. Snyder. When the cases moved from the Sixth Circuit, all of the cases from the Sixth Circuit were accepted. The Sixth Circuit involves Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. When all of those cases were consolidated and cert was granted by the United States Supreme Court on all of those cases, the caption had been DeBoer v. Snyder, but we filed our petition 2 hours after the Ohio case. The Ohio case was Obergefell v. Hodges. So when it was heard at the Sixth Circuit, the caption was DeBoer v. Snyder. But because we filed our petition a few hours late, it got flipped to Obergefell v. Hodges. Our case was about April and Jane, who were nurses. One was a NICU nurse. The other was an emergency room nurse who worked in hospitals in Detroit. And they had taken in, over the course of time, what came to be 5 children that they were raising together, but they were not permitted to jointly adopt these children who were born with a host of ailments. They were either abandoned at the hospital or they were surrendered to the state by their mother, their biological mother. And the state of Michigan had actually asked them to foster these kids because they had these special skill sets as nurses. But then when they wanted to adopt the children, the state was like, whoa, 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 no, you can foster these kids, but you can't adopt them, even though there was no one else who wanted to adopt these kids who had so many different, difficulties and issues and had been, born with, like, as I indicated, many issues. But Anyway, yeah, it was a unusual set of circumstances. April and Jane just happened to call me up one day, and I was handling cases that had to do with LGBTQ rights. We didn't have any types of protections for same-sex couples or LGBTQ individuals in the state of Michigan at all. In fact, they used to refer to us as Mississippi because we were seemingly so backwards. In fact, we were only one of 3 states that did not permit any sort of protection for same-sex couples' children who they were jointly raising together. So brought this case not as a marriage case, interestingly enough, as an adoption case. We challenged the Michigan adoption code, but the adoption code said that you could only adopt children together if you were a married couple. And it was the judge that we were drawn to in the Eastern District of Michigan, Judge Bernard Friedman, who has since retired, who said this really isn't a case about adoption at all, because if you could, you would get married. And so it is the Michigan Marriage Amendment that was part of our Constitution, still is, that indicates that same-sex couples can have no protections of any kind from the state, not even as a domestic partnership. They could not. Even if you called it something different, it is unconstitutional to have that kind of relationship recognized by law in accordance with the Michigan Constitution. But he said, I think this is really a marriage case. You ought to be challenging not the adoption code, but the marriage amendment itself. And that's how our case became an accident of history, but so did Jim Obergefell, because his case wasn't about, marriage as much as it was about a death certificate, because he was not permitted to put, his name as a spouse on the death certificate of his husband. So anyway, that's a long way of saying, it was just a case that took a lot of twists and turns. But if you read Obergefell v. Hodges, and if you haven't, I urge you to do it. It's really the story of April and Jane and their 5 children.
Wow, I did not know that. I had no idea. So for those of you who aren't familiar with exactly what Obergefell and Hodges decided, and what can you explain what parts of that ruling are being challenged or questioned now by the Supreme Court?
Well, as you, I'm sure, have heard, the other day, the court decided not to take up a petition from Kim Davis. Kim Davis was a clerk in a county in Kentucky. And after our ruling came down, immediately, because Obergefell v. Hodges, otherwise known as DeBoer v. Snyder, because that stood for the proposition that these marriage bans, whether the bans were constitutional in certain states, whether the bans were by statute, that you could not refuse to provide an otherwise qualified same-sex couple a marriage license just based on the fact that they were a same-sex couple versus an opposite-sex couple. You could still apply the other rules, right? Like if some states, you can get married at 16, some 17, some 18. In some states, you are forbidden from marrying your first cousin, but in other states you can. So all the other elements still applied, but you could not deny a marriage license to a couple just based on the fact that they were a same-sex couple versus an opposite-sex couple. And that did not sit well with Kim Davis. Kim Davis, who saw herself as being staunchly religious, no matter the fact that she had been married 4 times, divorced 3 times, and had multiple children, multiple different men. Again, no judgment, but she sure didn't have an issue judging the same-sex couples that came before her. And she said, based on religious grounds, that she would refuse to provide them a marriage license because it, was in contravention of her religious beliefs. And so as a result of that, she was ordered to provide a marriage license. She violated court orders. She was sued by same-sex couples and ordered to pay them for having violated their constitutional rights. And she had appealed that all the way to the United States Supreme Court, wanting at this point, with this court now, with 6 conservatives and 3 liberals, and out of the 6 conservatives, you have 3 of them who were dissenters from Obergefell v. Hodges. So she wanted them to take the case up, and they declined to, in my opinion, not because they don't want to revisit Obergefell. I think they very, very badly do, and they want to do the same thing to marriage equality that they did to abortion. But this was just an imperfect vehicle, I think, to do so. And frankly, I mean, Kim Davis was just, I don't think they wanted to make her the poster child for this poor clerk that had her religious rights violated by being forced to provide a marriage license to a same-sex couple. But I want to bring up something that's kind of interesting about our case. Remember, we tried this case. We had multiple witnesses testify. One of the witnesses, actually, that I cross-examined was a woman by the name of Lisa Brown, who was then and is still the Oakland County clerk. And when she testified, I said, do you ever have to contradict your religious beliefs when you issue a marriage license? And she said, all the time. There are people who ask for a marriage license, a man who murdered his previous wife, maybe served 10, 20, 30 years in prison, maybe still is in prison because you're allowed to still get married in prison because it's deemed a fundamental right. And she said, that contradicts my religious beliefs. I believe that people, that it's a sin to murder your wife and that you shouldn't be able to marry again. And I said, well, do you still have to issue that license anyway? And she said, yes. What about people who don't pay their child support? What about somebody who has, again, like 15 kids with, 20 different women and owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in child support and does nothing to support their children? Do you have to issue a marriage license to that person? Yes, I do. What about someone who, violates other tenets of your beliefs? Do you get to say, I don't think this person should have a marriage license? And she said, no, I don't get to make that decision. And I have to ignore my own religious beliefs and do what the law dictates. And are they qualified under the law, period? So we tackled that issue head on in our case. But I will say this, the Kim Davis case, to me, again, you have a situation where just in the Dobbs decision that, of course, involved abortion, in this case came down in 2022, Justice Thomas said right in there in his concurrence, that all cases that you're now overturning based on what had been due process rights that the court had found that are inherent to people under the 14th Amendment, they decided that abortion was not a right under the due process clause. And he said we should be revisiting all of these cases where that's been the finding. And that includes Obergefell, that includes Griswold v. Connecticut, which is a case involving contraception. And, he said it's time to revisit all of those cases, basically now that they have a majority on the court who seemingly wants to do so. So I don't think we should read anything into the denial of the petition for cert from Kim Davis. I think we'll see something else that gets to the court. What may happen before just an outright overturning of same-sex marriage, it may be, and we're starting to see this, that courts will say that people can treat opposite sex marriages and same-sex marriages differently depending on your religious beliefs. And I think they'll do that first before they just outright overturn Obergefell completely. But the fact is, the whole reason that people get married, yes, it's nice to be able to say we have this kind of commitment, but the biggest reason to marry are based on all the panoply of rights and protections that marriage provides to a person. So, for instance, health insurance is a huge one, right? How many people get married because you don't want to have 2 different sets of health insurance being as expensive as it is? But without, having the right to marry, many people were denied that. Other protections, I mean, we have a whole list of them, but like even getting to visit your spouse in the hospital, what's the first thing they say? Are you family? Are you family? What does family mean? It means we are married. And you know, you can't have anybody, an administrator at hospital, say refuse to allow a visitation from somebody who is your legal spouse. But you can if it's just like, I don't know, it's my partner. That's not the same. And I know that we use that phrase interchangeably, but being a partner is not the same as being a legal spouse. And there are a million other circumstances that I could talk about, including, like I said, the ability to adopt children together. And you can sort of understand that under the adoption code, like, yes, you want to have a certain level of commitment between these two people if they're going to adopt a child together, not just that they started dating a couple weeks ago, right? They have made a legal commitment to one another before they decide to have a child that they raise together legally. So, you know, with that, do I think that we're safe from and protected from Obergefell being overturned? I don't. I just think it'll be another case and not this one.
So thank you, because I know my whole social media feed is people breathing a sigh of relief. So I appreciate you driving that home. You said something that I would like for you to clarify a little bit more, where you said that you think that we'll see a ruling where same-sex marriages and straight marriages will be legally treated differently. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, what I could see happening, and what would not surprise me, is if you have an employer who says, "Hey, yes, I have a company, it is my company that I hold, and I have these particular religious beliefs, and in my religious beliefs, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, irrespective of what the law says." And it violates my religious beliefs to recognize this marriage by giving this employee health insurance, or even by hiring that person in the first place, or not firing them once you find out that they are in a same-sex marriage. And I will say that this was the dilemma that was faced by myself, actually, right after the ruling. It came down on a Friday, June 26th of 2015, and by Monday, I was getting calls from people who had gone to their employer and said, "I'd like to have my legal spouse listed. I want them to have health insurance. If there was an insurance policy, like various other things," and then they would get fired when they went to work on Monday and did that. Because at the time in Michigan, we did not have protections under our civil rights statute, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Statute, as it's known in Michigan. And sexual orientation and gender identity were not protected then. They are now. But so oddly, you could get legally married, but then you could get fired for being legally married to a person of the same sex. So, I could definitely see circumstances in the not too distant future where employers will be able to treat their employees differently, or will even be sort of given carte blanche to discriminate against someone based on their religious beliefs. And I think we're starting to see some of those cases percolate up the legal system as we speak right now. I think it's only a matter of time before we see one of those arrive at the Supreme Court.
Hmm. So it sounds like, so you feel like the threat of this being overturned or severely weakened is pretty strong. If you can talk about what will that mean to couples across the country, like I know how many states already have a ban on same-sex marriage, like Michigan does.
So we have 35 states in the United States of America that have marriage bans still on the books. That means either a constitutional amendment like we have in Michigan, or just a plain old regular statute. And I mean, that's a considerable number of states, of course.
Yeah.
But because of Obergefell, none of those statutes or constitutional amendments can be enforced because, again, Obergefell is crystal clear on this point. So in the event that Obergefell is overturned, what we're likely to see is sort of a Dobbs-like situation. It will go back to the states, and it'll be up to the state to decide As many of you might remember, so our marriage amendment to the Constitution of Michigan came about in 2004. And you might remember that Karl Rove, it was his genius idea in order to get George W. Bush reelected, was to put a whole bunch of these marriage bans and into ballot proposals that would drive Bush supporters to the polls. And so they had many of these that were proposed all around the country in 2004. So there's a lot of these constitutional amendments, which are much harder to change, by the way, than a statute. So if you have a regular statute that's on the books, and we have both, by the way, in Michigan, we have both the statute and we have a constitutional amendment, which is a little bit of overkill, in my opinion. But again, anything to get people to the polls in 2004. So what you would have to do for just a regular statute is just a simple bare majority of your state house and your state senate can repeal it, and then of course signed off on by your governor. But in states with a constitutional amendment, it's different for every state. But in Michigan, what you would have to do is there's two ways, really two main ways that you can repeal a constitutional amendment. One is if 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate in Michigan both decide to put this on the ballot, then the voters can vote on it. The second way in Michigan is through a petition drive, and many states have these. In Michigan, you need to get 10% of the total number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election, which for us is in 2022, to sign the petition. Then it goes on the ballot, and it needs a bare majority to repeal the marriage amendment. But what would happen to all the couples who are already married right now? Well, they would be grandfathered in. So if you are already in a same-sex marriage, it's not as though you lose all your rights to be married. But if Obergefell is overturned, it means in states like mine, the clerks will be unable legally, they cannot issue a marriage license to a same-sex couple if Obergefell were to be overturned, and we still have these laws on the books here. However, let me say something really important. Congress did something really important in 2022, and that was during a brief period of time when we had where Democrats were in the majority in the House of U.S. House of Representatives and in the United States Senate, and of course Joe Biden was president. He signed into law something called the Respect for Marriage Act, and this was very, very important. What it allowed for is reciprocity, full faith and credit for marriages performed in one state in another state. So let me give you an example. Let's go back to the first cousin marriages, right? Some states allow for first cousins to be legally married, and some states don't. But let's say you are wanting to marry your first cousin, and you're in Michigan where that's not allowed. You could go to another state, like for instance, Kentucky, where it is allowed, get married there, and then just come back to Michigan, and you would have full faith and credit for recognition of that marriage. Same thing if one state you have to be 18 to be married, another state you can get married at 17. If you're a couple of wild-eyed 17-year-olds, and I don't recommend this, by the way, who decide to get married, and it's not legal in one state, you go to another state, you come back, and you have full faith and recognition. This is really important, by the way, because prior to Obergefell, we did not have full faith and recognition for same-sex marriages. So even though it was already legal in some states, as of 2004, it was legal in Massachusetts. But you couldn't just go to another state then and have that marriage recognized. You can now. So 35 states, that right to get the marriage license there, to get married there would disappear, but the marriage would be recognized as long as you got married in a state that legally permitted it. And let me say this really difficult thing that was going on when you had this patchwork of states where you could literally drive across the country. You're married, then you're not married. You're married, then you're not married. You're married, then you're not married. Which was crazy because, like, what if you got in a car accident, you know? And all of a sudden, like, oh, this is a state where my marriage isn't recognized. They're not going to let me see my spouse because I have no legal rights. I'm considered to be a total legal stranger to this person in that state. It made no sense. What was happening a lot were a number of things. One, you would have same-sex couples who you'd have somebody who worked for like the military, or they worked for a large company that had several different not several different headquarters, but you could be transferred from state to state to state. And same-sex couples would say, like, I'm in California, you can't transfer me to Michigan because I'm not married there. So for employers, it was creating actually a real headache. The other thing that was really bad is that if you got married in another state, but then you moved to a state where your marriage wasn't recognized, you also couldn't get divorced because you can only get divorced in the place where you reside. You have to have a domicile, you have to live there. So if you got married in California or Massachusetts, or for a brief time, weirdly, Iowa was like, on the cutting edge. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But you come back to Michigan and now you're unable to get divorced because your state doesn't recognize the marriage. And for a brief period of time, you might remember the Windsor case. And that dealt with whether there would be federal recognition of a same-sex marriage. And this was actually a tax case, believe it or not, for a same-sex couple who was from New York, where the state of New York recognized their marriage, but the federal government didn't. So they had to file jointly for their state taxes, but then they had to file their taxes individually as separate entities for the federal government. So they brought a case, and for a period of time, the federal government would recognize your marriage anywhere in the United States. So you had to file your taxes jointly in many cases, or married but separate, you could, but then you couldn't file jointly in your own state. But then, as I said, also, you'd come back to your home state and you were unable to get divorced. So you're just linked to this person forever and ever, having your marriage recognized by the federal government, but unable to get divorced at all in the state in which you live, which you can imagine that was a headache as well. And that's why when we see this patchwork of fundamental rights, and this is what the Supreme Court did say in the Obergefell case, they said that marriage is a fundamental right, subjecting it to strict scrutiny. That's the highest level of scrutiny under the law. And so in order, if you are doing anything to encumber a fundamental right, there has to be a compelling reason, and it's got to be narrowly tailored to fit whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve. That's why people in prison get to be married, because it's considered to be a fundamental right. And you can't deny it to somebody, even if they, again, killed their last 3 wives and they're in prison for that. So all that being said, this patchwork of system is really bad. We've seen it with reproductive rights and how hard it is where, you go to one state and you have the right to terminate a pregnancy. And then you move one state over and now you can go to prison for the rest of your life for the thing that you could do sometimes if you were only a couple hundred yards away. It's just not generally how things should work under federalism and under a democracy like ours, where your rights are so significantly different depending on where you happen to be in the United States that day. So it's really problematic.
So if I understand correctly, the Respect for Marriage Act is statute. So so it would just take a trifecta to undo that, and then marriages would not have this protection of reciprocity.
So if Obergefell fell, and obviously there's a Republican trifecta that is pretty hostile to LGBT rights at the federal government. Yeah, they could at any time now, they could repeal the Respect for Marriage Act. And if that was repealed and Obergefell was overturned, then that's correct. You would go back to this patchwork a system where you'd only have your marriage recognized in 15 states.
Wow. That is, so I want to take a moment to talk about the states efforts right now. And I do want to point out that there are two of the ballot initiative campaigns that have actually co-sponsored this event, which is in Michigan and in Ohio. And there are representatives from that campaign here in the audience tonight. And there are also currently ballot initiative efforts in Missouri, Virginia, and Oregon. So to my knowledge, maybe you know of more, there are currently 5 constitutional ballot initiative efforts, and my colleague Katie is going to put all of the links to those in the chat as well. Do you,
And sorry to interrupt, but I just had to say this. This is why, like we knew that Dobbs was coming, right? I mean, as soon as Kavanaugh was appointed to the court, you knew that there was a majority that was willing to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's why they were there. Remember, there's a litmus test from the Heritage Foundation in order for them to even make the short list to be a Trump appointee. We know the same is true with Obergefell. We know for a fact that this court wants to do it. Just because they haven't done it yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen, right? And so no time like the president, it really bothers me because when I ran for office in 2018, all I could talk about at the time was Roe v. Wade. And I was like, this is going to happen. Maybe it happens this year, this term, maybe it's the next Supreme Court term, but this will happen. And all right, so, it took a few years, but finally they overturned Roe v. Wade and they didn't hesitate to do it once they had the votes. This is going to happen. There is going to be a huge chipping away of these types of rights for same-sex couples. And it's not maybe, and it's not probably, it is a certainty. And we're already seeing like every time the court takes an LGBTQ themed case, whether it has to do with somebody, who's being made to bake a cake and can't discriminate, or somebody who is a website designer, or whether it has to do with LGBTQ themed books in the library or teaching LGBTQ themed matters in school. Like every single one of these cases, when the Supreme Court takes it, it's not a good thing in terms of rights for this protected class. So I'm just saying it like I had a lot of people when I was running for office in 2018 be like, oh, you're being so dramatic and using hyperbole and telling everyone that Roe v. Wade's going to be overturned. And I was like, yes, because there's 100% chance this is going to happen. And I would say like no time like the present. It's best to prepare for the fact that this is likely going to happen. And if we wait until such time as it actually happens, I think a lot of people are going to be pretty upset about it. We have well over 800,000 same-sex couples that are married in the United States today. That number generally has tended to increase because the more that people accept that LGBTQ people should be able to marry, and these should be rights that people have under the law, and people get used to it. The more that they watch like Modern Family and whatever other kinds of shows where they normalize the relationships between people of the same sex, if we think to ourselves, well, we're safe, oh, this has been the law of the land for 10 years, this is never going to happen. Please don't listen to people who say that to you, right? Because we know that this is going to happen. We know this is how this court feels. And it is literally only a matter of time. And just because it didn't happen with the Kim Davis case doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It will happen. It's up for us right now to make sure that we're responding to it as quickly as possible, in my opinion.
I'm under the belief, please correct me if I'm wrong, that there were also a number of cases with reproductive rights that tried to get to the Supreme Court that were declined until they got the Dobbs case and they were like, this is the one. Is that accurate?
Well, yes, and there were a number of cases that they were, as time went on, they were chipping away at rights and they were making it more and more difficult. There were some states that had laws on the books that made it so difficult to get an abortion that for all intents and purposes, it almost was already illegal, right? Because they had all these limitations on, who could perform an abortion and under, how big the hallways had to be in the hospital and what kind of licensure you had to have, and insurance rates that could be different for, providers of abortion versus other types of procedures that really were more dangerous than abortion. I mean, the list goes on and on. So they already were in the process of making it more and more difficult, allowing more and more laws that infringed on the right to terminate a pregnancy, until finally they just did away with it altogether.
So for same-sex couples, I'm not talking about what the state can do in terms of ballot initiative, but just for the couple it's themselves, is there anything couples can do to protect themselves? Legal contracts, anything that they
Well,
can do?
I mean, yes, but that was all the things that we had to do before same-sex marriage. That was the whole point, right? And I will say that, look, this, I'm not just talking about this in the abstract. All of these terrible things happened to me. I am, I'm a lesbian. I am in a same-sex marriage, and I remember what it was like. I mean, I remember when, my family, we couldn't even get a family gym membership. We had to pay all separately because we weren't considered a family. I remember what it was like for me, that when, our son had to have surgery in the hospital, and even though I had a big trial going on, I had to be there because my partner, who was not then my legal spouse, wasn't allowed, was not allowed to adopt my children that are now our children. And as a result, wasn't allowed to go visit our children in the hospital. So what we would do is we would try our hardest to do, have the sort of documents, the guardianship documents, the conservatorship documents, the type of paperwork that you fill out when you don't have a legal relationship to that person, right? Whether it's a will, whether it's a living will as to like what your preferences are for end of life treatment. I mean, those are the kinds of things that once you are in a legal relationship with somebody, a legal marriage, they just get to make some of those decisions because they're your legal spouse. So like, what's the point of having legal marriage if we're going to tell everybody, well, make sure you have a guardianship, paperwork filled out, make sure you have, conservatorship paperwork filled out, make sure that you both have your names on every one of your cars, right? Because the way it works right now is, my wife has a car that primarily she uses, but because we bought it with marital funds, guess what? If we get divorced, that's my car too. But, and don't tell her that because she really likes that car. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, that was the whole point, is that like when you're married and you have income coming in together, unless you have a prenup or something, it's considered marital funds, not when you don't have a relationship that is legally binding. So yeah, we could tell people to do all those things, but like, how about instead we just continue to have same-sex marriage be legal in our states?
Yeah. I want to change the focus slightly, because the whole mission of our organization is protecting the separation between religion and government, and it's our belief that without the separation of religion and government, that nobody has religious liberty. So many opponents of marriage equality are claiming that rolling back these rights is an issue of religious freedom. So from your perspective, and I want to hear your perspective, not only as an attorney, but also as a Jewish woman yourself, how do you respond to that framing of this being a religious liberty issue?
Well, first of all, I think that, as a person of Jewish faith, it has always been my fear, this eroding of the wall between church and state. That is never good for anyone who is a religious minority, because obviously the religion that will be respected in the end will only be the religion of the majority. And, you know, I remember this really well from going back to that Oakland County clerk I talked about, Lisa Brown. Prior to her becoming a clerk, she was a state representative. And they were passing a number of laws that infringed on abortion rights in Michigan. And she talked about the fact that, like, hold on a second, you're infringing on my rights. She's Jewish. And she said, in my faith, if you have to decide between the rights of the unborn fetus and the, fully formed mother, you choose the mother and not the fetus. And these were bills that were being passed that, would have really, really curtailed the ability of even a woman who was having massive complications with her pregnancy and could even die from being able to seek that abortion. But the point that she made then, and the point that we see now, is like, it doesn't matter that as Jews, that is part of our religious faith for most people. That is the way that we view abortion rights. It's not going to be our religious view that's going to be protected. It will be the religious viewpoint of uh, not just of people of Christian faith, who still are the majority in this country, but a certain kind of a certain version of Christianity. And it's one of the things that makes our country great, is that our laws are made not just to conform to one religion over another. And that has always been part of the First Amendment. But what has been so clever about what the Heritage Foundation has done, and folks on the far right, is they figured out a way to use the First Amendment not as a shield to protect religious minorities, but as a sword to skewer the rights of religious minorities. And they've done that time and time again, and they're utilizing the First Amendment as a weapon to say, I get to discriminate against you, or I get to tell you how to live your life based on my religious viewpoints. And I'm going to say that I'm being discriminated against if I can't do that. And again, like, let's go back to the Kim Davis case, right? She's the one who's being discriminated against. Now, nobody made her run for clerk, right? If you don't want to, if there are certain people that your religion forbids from recognizing their marriages, and it conflicts with the law, like, get another job. I mean, you don't have to do that job, but if you do, you have to follow the law, and you can't, and just to say, well, this conflicts with my religious beliefs. And we see this all the time with other things, right? That we're starting to see again, this creep of, and this erosion of the wall between church and state. To say, as a pharmacist, I'm not going to give you PrEP because I think that you're using PrEP as to prevent contracting HIV. And I think that you're probably doing it because you are in a same-sex relationship you're a man with another man. I'm not going to give you this prescription. Or for abortion medication, I'm not going to give you abortion medication, even though your doctor has prescribed it for you, and it's totally legal in this state, because I personally think that abortion is a sin, or you're trying to you manage your miscarriage, and I don't think that you should be able to do that, because whatever happens to you medically happens because God dictates it, and I'm not going to interfere with that process. I mean, you can extend this to literally almost anything. I mean, can you imagine, like, whether I'm a government lawyer, right? I mean, for me to be able to say to someone, hey, we have laws on the books about a person being afforded due process under the law, but I think that you have committed one of many acts, right? It could be a homicide case. It could be a sexual assault case. It could be somebody who's abused their elders. I'm not going to provide you with due process because I think that you're a murderer or a rapist or an elder abuser. And you don't get that because it violates my religious tenets. Like, yeah, that does absolutely 100%. As a person of Jewish faith, I think people shouldn't murder other people. I think people shouldn't rape other people. But it doesn't mean that I get to sidestep your due process rights because of my religious beliefs. Think about how we could extend that to literally anything. But now we're at the point where it's part of your religious expression to bake a cake. I mean, that's our Supreme Court has said that. Me baking a cake for you on the occasion of your wedding violates my rights. And we're seeing it over and over again, and it's just getting worse and worse and more troubling. And it used to be that it was the federal courts that protected us from these things. And instead, now it is the federal courts that are causing these issues. And I think it's very troubling. There's no question about it. And it's especially troubling, again, if you are a religious minority.
And it's no coincidence that there are also quite a few different faith-based groups who have co-sponsored this event. There's a Hindu group, there's a Baptist group, there's a Unitarian group, there's several different religious groups because of exactly what you're saying, that, we don't want a situation where only the majority religion is being protected. So you've been a really strong example of how state leaders can defend civil rights, even when federal protections are at risk. I feel so lucky to have you as my Attorney General, because I know you're always out there really defending us. So what advice do you have for other elected officials who aren't as lucky as Michigan is, who want to uphold equality and justice in these times?
Well, first of all, I think it's to be outspoken about these issues, even when you think it's not popular to do so. Understanding that it's very, very hard, whether it is through legislation, whether it's through the courts, it's hard to create a right. But it's really easy for it to be stripped away. And it's important for people to know, once you've lost something that was previously something that you were, a protection that you had, or a right that was granted to you under the law, getting it back is very, very difficult. And so it's important to pay attention always to those things. I know that I'll just give you, for instance, when it came to Donald Trump's first election, there were a lot of people like myself who were out there saying, he's already talking about restricting people's right to have an abortion. I mean, he was. And obviously, Hillary Clinton was very clear about where she stood. And also, she had a track record, so we would know how she stood on that. But people said, no, I don't really think this is going to happen. I think it's okay for us to go ahead and put somebody in office, even though we're not sure about how things are going to go for this particular right or that particular right. Like, believe people when they tell you who they are, and make sure that you're always fighting to protect these rights. And as I've said to many people, like, listen, it is totally a laudable thing to say that my priority is the affordability of things. I mean, people die when they can't have affordable housing, right? Or they don't have affordable health care and all those other things. They're so important. But we also really have to pay attention to what candidates for office tell us they think about these various different kinds of rights. Because again, in the end, maybe nothing will impact you more than losing those rights. And I think we have to be very outspoken about it. And we have to me, like, I don't care how much poll testing tells me that I shouldn't be talking about reproductive rights all the time. I'm still going to talk about it because it's still important to me. And I think people have to understand, what was always interesting to me, sadly, The Handmaid's Tale has become more of a reality for a lot of people than, science fiction, as I think it was originally sort of intended to be by Margaret Atwood. But, a lot of us saw it coming and we talked about it, and people, us again, you're crazy. That's not going to happen. Why are you being so dramatic about it? When we see these kinds of things happening, we have to act. And I think it's so important that people understand that, voting is essential, not just sometimes, not just once in a while, but all the time. And we're lucky because we get to see how people, what people's stances are on issues a lot more easily than back in the day. I mean, you can go online and oftentimes easily now know what people's stances are on a particular issue. But even at the local level, we know that people who we vote for city council or city commission, or, they go on and they serve on their county commission. They go on and become a state rep or a state senator. They go on and become a United States representative or senator or attorney general or president. And so even at the lowest levels of government, who you have in those offices matters, and what their perspective is on these rights matters. And to me, I don't know that there's anything more important than separation between church and state. And I don't care how many times certain people will say that somehow our founding fathers, intended us to be a Christian country. That's not true. And we know it's not true. And at the end of the day, when you look at The Handmaid's Tale, the thing that was so notable to me about it when I read it a million years ago I think in the early 90s, was how miserable everyone was. Like nobody was happy when you had this deep erosion of rights. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's how it's going to end up being if we lose all of these freedoms that we have now. I don't know that it'll make anybody happy. But we have to pay attention to this, and we have to be outspoken about it, and we have to prioritize it. Because again, the economy, the price of goods goes up and down. And again, not that we shouldn't care about it, because we should. But at the end of the day, losing fundamental rights, that will impact us forever and in ways that I think are hard for people to imagine.
So when you're talking about how this is gonna happen, do you think that same-sex couples should consider relocating to other states or to other countries? Are people safe here? Will, you know, will local officials be able to discriminate? What's your advice or your intuition about this?
Well, I mean, firstly, obviously, I mean, I hate seeing again patchworks of rights the way that we're seeing it right now. Let's talk about gender affirming care for a second, right? Gender affirming care for transgender youth. This has been a standard for quite some time, and this is something that is approved of by the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association. If you talk to renowned sociologists and psychologists, and of course, doctors, this is something important so that, this vulnerable group of individuals, I mean, the highest rates of suicide for trans youth. But now we have, the law has changed such that you have in about half the states in the country, they've banned, any type of gender affirming care. And then we're not talking about surgeries. We're talking about, medications. We're talking about hormones.
Mm.
And, the federal government is trying to use the weight of the Department of Justice to try to investigate either healthcare facilities, healthcare providers, physicians who are even in states where it's not illegal. And in fact, in states like mine, it's not just that it's not illegal, but you know, gender identity is a protected class under our state law.
Mm.
And yet you still see some of these institutions and some of these healthcare providers, Corewell Health here, the University of Michigan healthcare system here, who's saying, we're just not going to provide it anymore, even though I would argue you're required to under state law. So, this obeying in advance thing is just been absolutely awful. People who are literally now, I'd say, violating the law to make this administration happy, and to understand that this administration is not going to stop at any lengths to stop discriminating against people that it doesn't care for, whether those are, people that are immigrant communities, whether it's transgender people. I mean, there's no hiding from an administration like this one. So I would say it's first of all like calling out those institutions when they fail us, calling out law firms when they say we are going to cave to the demands of the Trump administration, even though we're not legally required to, and we could fight it in court. Um, I think that we have to fight back as hard as we can when we see these kinds of things happening, or it'll just be too late. But yeah, do I see people who are moving to other states, and even companies that now are saying, I don't want to do business in a state that discriminates against LGBTQ people, or I don't want to do business in a state that discriminates against women and treats their health care differently than they would treat health care if it was provided to a man. Uh, I, I think that boycotts work. They certainly work against companies, and we've seen that certainly with Target. Look how much money Target lost as a result of them revoking all of their DEI policies. So there's a lot of different ways that people can, can do this, but I hate to see people say, well, everybody who lives in Florida come move to Michigan. Now I would love to have all the Floridians who are disaffected come to my state. I think nothing could be better for the state of Michigan, a state where we have a constitutional right under our state constitution to not just abortion, but also to manage a miscarriage, also to fertility treatments. I mean, the whole gamut of these rights are enshrined in our state constitution. And it's important to do that as much as possible and understand it's popular. Even in otherwise red states, when you have a ballot proposal like that, it usually passes with flying colors. Same thing when it comes to same-sex marriage, to make sure that that is a right that is enshrined in your constitution. So to the extent that we can in our various states, I think that these ballot proposals are really important so that even when these fundamental rights are lost in the federal courts, they are enshrined into our states. And so when we have this patchwork of, what's legal in one state, what's not legal in another state, we have the protections automatically in our states, whatever state that we live in. But, we're in for some dark times right now if people don't spend the time to really understand what people who are candidates for office or in elected office are saying and doing. And if we ignore our rights in favor of what we think is a short-term fix for something economically. Again, I'm not telling people not to care about how the way that the economy affects them. They should care deeply. But, the thing that makes America the greatest to me is the fact that we have all of these rights that are protected under our Constitution. And if we lose that, then there's nothing that the federal government or even our states can't do to us.
So I want to say a little bit more about the ballot proposals. And again, I want to repeat that the states that currently have ballot measures that they're working on is Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, Virginia, and Oregon. And all of those links are in the chat. I also want everyone here to know that, first of all, running these ballot proposals is enormously expensive. I can tell you that to enshrine reproductive rights in Michigan, that campaign cost $55 million. Every single one of these campaigns would love to have a donation from you. There's donate links to all of them in the chat. They also would love to have you volunteer. I know I spoke to the organizer in Michigan and in Ohio. There are many opportunities to volunteer even remotely, so you don't have to feel like you have to live in those states to help. We all need to help everyone in the country have these rights, whether you live in that state or not. Is anything that you want to add to the ballot initiatives, AG Nessel?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we shouldn't have to do it, right? But we are where we are. And the fact is, once you lose these protections from the United States Supreme Court, you're going to need to have these protections in the state. And I will just give you an example. In Michigan, when it comes to challenges to to our constitutional provisions that, again, protect, that were passed in 2022, that protect reproductive rights. I mean, the challenges are losing in the courts. And, our rights remain really firm. I'm just going to give you an example of something that's happening in Michigan right now. There's a case that was brought by some folks involving advanced directives. We still have a law in the books by statute that if you are a man, you can ask for an advanced directive as to, in the event that you're in a coma, for instance. Like, what do you want? Do you want to have life-saving measures to keep you alive, or do you not want that and want to be able to pass on your own terms in that instance? And if you are a non-pregnant woman, you can ask for the same thing. But did you know that in Michigan, if you are a pregnant woman, you lose the right to have an advanced directive that you don't want to be kept alive without those life-saving Herculean life support measures? Well, you know what? I have every confidence what's going to happen is that's going to be struck down. As you know, in Georgia, there was a pregnant woman who was brain dead and was, kept alive through artificial means until, her pregnancy could come to term. And it was so barbarian, what they were doing to this person's body, because they weren't allowed to make that choice for themselves, even if they had decided ahead of time, here's what I want to see happen to me in those circumstances. Well, that challenge, I can pretty much guarantee that challenge is going to be successful to strike down the law that says that pregnant women don't have the right to make decisions over what happens to them in those circumstances because of our constitutional amendment. And there's many, many other things that I think protections that people who are pregnant, people who are seeking, again, to manage their miscarriage, people who are seeking fertility treatments, things like that, that I know we will be in good shape in Michigan to protect those rights because of that constitutional amendment. So it's so much better than having a statute. Having a statute is not nothing, but a statute obviously can easily be changed, but also having it as your constitutional right in your states, is provided so much more significance by the courts. And right in this particular amendment, it actually says that strict scrutiny shall apply to these rights, meaning it's much harder to overturn them because that is the highest level of judicial scrutiny. So, I mean, I'm if you can't get your legislators to do the right thing, then we know that these are very, very popular. Understandably, as you indicated, they're incredibly expensive, but they also work.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to read some of the questions that are coming in the chat. So I'm going to read these to clarify, was there a new case regarding Obergefell that SCOTUS refused to hear, or was it just by a petition by Kim Davis to re-rule on the original case?
Well, yeah, it was the same basic fundamental components of the Kim Davis case, but she did ask for a direct challenge to be able to say, I want you to overturn Obergefell completely, not just I want you to set aside these fines that I have that she had not paid yet, or the court judgment that allowed for I think various different let's see, torts that were alleged that allowed for her to allowed these same-sex couples to get damages and economic awards. But it also was just a head-on challenge at that point to the underlying principles of Obergefell. So she did ask for that, but they just didn't take it. And now the ruling of the Sixth Circuit will stand as a result, which means that she is going to have to pay those fines. And she is going to have to pay those economic damages to the couples.
Yeah, I imagine she probably has some organizations helping her with that.
Oh, I think that's likely the case. Yeah.
Yeah. So here I have another question from the chat. So suppose that a SCOTUS ruling reverts marriage to the states Okay, I was literally in the middle of reading this and then it disappeared. All right, the tide has shifted now where a lot of people do support marriage equality. Could an attorney general choose to not enforce an amendment while the legislature works to get a proposal on the ballot?
Well, see that worked for, so when it came to the 1931 abortion ban that pretty much sprang into effect after the Dobbs decision in my state, I said, as Attorney General, I am not going to prosecute a woman who terminates her pregnancy in accordance with that 1931 law that would have allowed me to do so. So I said, that's not something I'm going to do. I have prosecutorial discretion. And this has been a fundamental right for 50 years. I'm not going to now choose to prosecute women for doing the same thing that they've been doing for years, protected by the law. But when it comes to same-sex couples, I mean, it's the clerks that issue the marriage license. So, I mean, Bill Schuette, my predecessor, who was my Republican who was in office for 8 years prior to me being in there, he tried to issue directives to the clerks to tell them what they could or couldn't do. And the clerks were like, no, thanks. I'm going to listen to the courts, Bill Schuette. I'm not going to listen to you. So when he issued a directive saying, no, you cannot provide same-sex couples with marriage licenses after we had gotten our district court opinion where our district court judge struck down the marriage bans, uh, you know, most of the clerks were like, thanks, but no thanks. I think I'll follow the law and not what you're saying. I mean, at the end of the day, the Attorney General doesn't make the law. The Attorney General enforces the laws, but it's the clerks who would be beholden to whatever the law says in regard to their ability to issue or not issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, so this one is just so long. I don't know if I'll be able to read all this, but let me try and read this question to you. You mentioned Michigan has both a statute and a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. My state, I don't know what state they're from, also has this dual prohibition, but it's working towards amending the state constitution. Do you think leaving the statute intact is an issue? So in other words, if they change the constitution, but the statute remains in place is an issue. Also, the state statute states that when you enter into a marriage that is not legal under the law, it will be considered void in ab initio. Do you see any concerns with that verbiage?
Well, what you would say, and I don't have the exact language in front of me for any of these, but what you would say is basically is that supersedes any statutes under the law. So your constitutional amendment basically would in of itself, uh, hold any of those statutes basically null and void at that point because they're contradicted by the constitutional amendment. So you don't really need to change the statutes as long as you have a constitutional amendment.
Okay. But you can't change the statute. If there's a constitutional amendment, the constitutional amendment will take priority.
Precedence, right, correct.
Precedence. Yes. So you had talked earlier about that you think that there might end up being a situation where same-sex couples the marriage is still legal, but they can be discriminated against. Does that also mean that the state and local governments will be allowed to discriminate against same-sex married couples if that were the case?
So we're going to have to see. It would depend on the facts and the circumstances of the case as to whether or not that would apply to government officials versus somebody who is, has a private employer, for instance. And there are many times where if you are a private employer, you are held to a different standard than if you are the government. But, depending on how a situation unfolded, it might be that they say, yes, even if you work for the government, then you have religious rights and you don't have to provide, I don't know, certain rights or benefits to somebody under circumstances that violate your First Amendment beliefs. It's possible. Generally speaking, though, you are again held to a different standard.
So I have two more questions. This one I'm reading from our friends from Ohio Equal Rights, which is the ballot campaign there. In Ohio, we have a parallel ballot initiative to end qualified immunity that we have partnered with. Can we touch on the qualified immunity element to Davis's claim and how unequal protection for government officials contributes to people like her feeling emboldened to disregard the law for their specific religious beliefs?
Well, that's a tough one because, the problem with eliminating qualified immunity means that you just won't have people who want to work in all kinds of different positions, right? And whether that's working for the government, as a clerk, whether it's being a police officer, whether it's being a teacher in a public school, really the list goes on and on to being a prosecutor, right? I've been a prosecutor for many, many years. It's a pretty scary thing when you try to eliminate qualified immunity altogether. And I think that, having been on both sides, I have sued government officials, and I've been a government official. But I do appreciate the importance oftentimes of us having qualified immunity so that our government can operate. And remember, there are still many ways in which you can successfully sue a government actor or a government entity. It's not as though there's no way to do it, but it's just as a higher standard as to, what you would need in order to be successful in that lawsuit, or who you could sue successfully in accordance with that lawsuit. So, I don't want to say like, oh, if as long as you eliminate any immunity, then you won't have a situation where, a clerk would deny a same-sex marriage license, because I see lots of times right now, for instance, and I'll use the Michigan State Police as an example. There's this sort of forceful pushback on anything that is DEI related. And we now have a lot of white men that have, dozens of reverse discrimination lawsuits against the Michigan State Police for any efforts that were made, oftentimes to like recruit Black troopers or recruit female troopers, all the rest. So I just, what's good for the goose and what's good for the is what isn't necessarily what's good for the gander. Do you see what I'm trying to say a little bit?
Yeah.
That I think we have to be like really, really careful and cautious, because when we say, well, we're eliminating, government immunity, it can have all kinds of other impacts that one might not have thought about ahead of time. And I think that for a lot of people, it will make them really scared to work in government at all.
Yeah. So I lied when I said we only had one more question. I have a few more coming in. Can you elaborate on the restroom bill? I'm not sure what she's referring to. Perhaps you do.
I don't.
Okay. All right. So whoever wrote that question, if you can give more information, how can everyone be a better ally to the LGBTQ plus community, especially now?
I think it's speaking up and speaking up in defense of rights for the LGBTQ community and doing it in all different kinds of settings. You know, I when you're silent, I think oftentimes you're complicit because you're not saying anything. And I just want to say this outright, I'm not endorsing in our race for US Senator, but one of the candidates that is running for US Senate is a state senator, and she kind of made her name nationally by giving a speech about how even though she's a white Christian, straight, cisgender, married woman, she's still going to speak up on behalf of the LGBTQ community, because, if she stays silent, then then she's complicit in some of the really damaging, verbiage out there that a lot of our electeds are using, and that has made its way into every sphere, it seems like, of not just government, but also of whether it's schools, whether it's the social media. And so she spoke up about that, saying, like, people like me have to be the voice sometimes for those that feel as though they're marginalized and those who feel like they're voiceless. And so she said, I have a voice and I'm going to use it. And I know that her speech about this went viral. Millions of people saw it and liked it and understood. Like, everyone has to speak up. And of course, you'll always appreciate first they came for the socialists, but, they'll always end up coming for all, it'll start with marginalized classes. It'll start with minority groups of people, but eventually it affects all of society. And if we wait to speak up until it affects us, then it's going to be too late by the time it does. And that's why I think we have to be so outspoken. And frankly, that's why a lot of new people ended up running for office. I know when I did in 2018, that was the first time I ran for anything. I had never run for, well, they say dog catcher is the term we use. In Michigan, we don't elect our dog catchers, so it never made sense to me why we would use that phrase. But I never ran for anything at all. Not even, local school board or anything. But those things still matter. But it's what compelled me to run for office, because I was sick of seeing elected officials who wouldn't speak up and who wouldn't be strong on these issues. And I said, at a certain point, you just say, I think I can do better, and so I'm going to try.
Thank you. So let me read another question to you. Some SCOTUS monitors caution us that the foundation for weakening Obergefell has already been established in an immigration case decided last summer, which was the state versus Muniz. If Obergefell were to remain valid, but the 1,000 plus constitutional rights guaranteed by it to same-sex couples were to be weakened and hollowed out by SCOTUS and religious exemptions in the future, how might we challenge this, quote, skim milk marriage in court?
Yeah, and skim milk marriage was a term that was used by Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually during the course of the Obergefell case. I mean, she asked a question about there being some marriages that, have the full panoply of rights, and then some marriages that only have some of those rights, and how, like, that's not the point of marriage. It's that, and that is inherently discriminatory. Inherently, it violates the due process clause and the equal protection clause. And it means that marriage isn't really seen as a fundamental right if you can treat some marriages different than other marriages. So I think that we have already seen the beginning of that. Like, we are seeing this weakening start to happen. And when you say how can we fight back against that? Well, like I said, voting matters a whole lot. And I mean, it's like a little bit too late for me to talk about that now, because I think some of the worst things that we could have anticipated happening have started to happen. But this court was put into place already after Trump's first term. So, some of the things that I expect out of people that I elect to Congress, we're talking a lot right now about the midterm elections in 2026. Do you know what I want to hear from people that I'm going to vote for to be members of Congress, whether it's in the House of Representatives or in the Senate? I want to know what you're going to do about the Supreme Court. And, we didn't hear a whole lot, in the last election about this, but yeah, maybe we do need to have term limits, and you don't get to serve out the whole rest of your life. You're only on the court for 15 years or for 20 years. Maybe we do need to have a serious conversation about expanding the court. We're allowed to expand the United States Supreme Court through a congressional act. It's not part of the Constitution that you would then have to change. And so, I mean, when I hear the various people who are running for the Senate, who are running for the House, I want to know, will you vote to expand the court? Because I think that if ever there was a situation where we needed to do that, it's probably right now. I mean, let's remember what happened with Antonin Scalia's seat, right? He died, I want to say, in February of Obama's last year in office. And even though he moved to appoint Merrick Garland as the next United States Supreme Court justice, Mitch McConnell came up with the genius idea that he wasn't even going to get a hearing, no matter how qualified he might have been for the Supreme Court. So I think that, we have to take audacious action. We need bold action in this time period where people who seek to diminish the rights of so many people, they're acting boldly. They're not being cautious. If we're allowed to do it under the law, then why would we not have that expectation? And I will tell you that, I was very upset at the fact that there were so many things that, but not for Kristen Sinema, but not for Joe Manchin, protections that could have been put into place but never were. I want to know why. Why couldn't Puerto Rico become a state? Why couldn't Washington, D.C. become a state? These were things that could have happened, but for the fact that we elected people who were too afraid to do that, even though they were Democrats. And so for me, when I'm seeing people who are running for these, very high offices that would have the authority to do that, don't skip the question about what's going to happen with the Supreme Court, because I think it's as important as anything else. I said this to my family back in 2016. It was election night, and things weren't growing great, and panic was starting to rise up in my family, in the household. And at the time, our kids were still fairly young, and they're like, this can all be undone. Like anything that Trump does in office can be undone, right? And I said, almost anything, but not the Supreme Court. And who knew that he would get not one, not two, but three appointments to the Supreme Court? So it's time for us to take this very, very seriously. So for all the things that you're talking about, so many of these things could be fixed as long as we are willing to take a fresh and new approach to, again, how long people can serve on the Supreme Court and how many people can serve on the Supreme Court.
So to change how long they could serve on the Supreme Court, that would also be a constitutional amendment, correct?
I don't know if lifetime appointments are part of the US Constitution. I'll be candid about that. I know for certain, though, that you can add more members to the court without changing the Constitution.
And
I'm
would
sure
you
that would be a quick Google
Google
AI
search?
question.
Yeah. Would you be worried that if a liberal majority expanded the Supreme Court, then just the next time there was a conservative majority, they would expand it and it would just keep balancing, equaling itself, canceling each other out?
I mean, maybe, but what are our alternatives right now? I mean, let's just say this, when there is a Republican trifecta, there's nothing that they're, oh, this is going to look bad for us later, I mean, I mean, my office is just involved, and we're still involved in this effort to ensure that SNAP benefits are utilized in accordance with the law during a government shutdown to recipients. And here we have, I mean, there are 25 states that challenged this and said, you have to use the contingency money to cover people who are going to starve to death, children, the disabled, the elderly. And yet there wasn't one Republican, not one, who was willing to stand up in a court of law and say, feed the people of our state that need to be fed. Not one. So they're not afraid to say, let's let people starve to death. So I just don't understand, if you're a Democrat, if you're a person who, sees yourself more on the left, why are we afraid all the time to take bold action? Because I can tell you, those on the far right, they're not afraid of that.
And this is a perfect opportunity for me to remind everybody that we are a nonpartisan organization. I do have my final question for you, and I want to thank you so much. So you've spent really your entire career fighting for equality and justice. So what I want to know now is, in this time, what gives you hope?
I would say that the election a week ago gave me hope. We had just massive voter turnout at all levels. People voting for Supreme Court justices in their state, people voting for governors, people voting for uh, you know a litany of different of different officials in a litany of different races in all different parts of the country. And you saw a turnout that was incredible in numbers that I don't know that we've seen before for a non-presidential year. And what that tells me is that people do care, they are watching, they do notice, and they're willing to stand up and allow their voices to be heard through the ballot box. And so that did give me great hope because for a long time now, since the second Trump administration started on January 20th, some, I don't know, 3.5 decades ago, it feels like, I I don't know. I wonder sometimes, like, does anybody care about this? Is anybody else upset when they see some of these things happening? Does anybody else care when they see, masked ICE officers literally, plucking people off the streets? Does anybody else care when you see, a $400 million Qatari jet that the president decides to make his own, or or just literally like out of thin air bombing people who are in boats, near the coast of Venezuela with no information about like what did these people do? Why do you think that they're a threat to the United States? Did they commit? Are they drug runners even? And if they are, why are they getting the death penalty? Is that okay? I mean, there's a million different things that I could say where I've felt for a long time like, am I the only one who cares about this? Does no one care about it? Is everybody just fine with this? And I think the answer to that a week ago on election day was people do care.
Mm,
And they want to do something about it. They want to make their voices heard in the best possible way to do that, which is by voting.
mhm. Yeah, I saw even library board. I saw we actually co-sponsored a candidate forum for library board, which is not something most people usually pay attention to. I want to remind everybody that we do have a survey, which we would greatly appreciate it if you fill out. That helps us with our programming enormously. Our next program is going to be, we have a monthly call with us where we will take you through all the steps of legislative advocacy, starting with finding out who your elected representative is, how to call, and so please join us for the call with us. AG Nessel, I cannot thank you enough. I am so grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I just wish we could clone you and have you be the Attorney General in every state. And thank you so much for everything you've done for the state of Michigan and for the entire country.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And I don't know. I think that America's worth fighting for.
That is those are the perfect words to end on, that we are definitely worth fighting for. And thank you for all of the comments you made about the importance of separation of religion and government. I can already imagine that we're going to try and make probably a recording of you saying all of those things. Thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me. Have a good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.